For this presentation, I will be talking about the basal ganglia and its effect in causing Parkinson's disease. My name is Austin Collum, and I am a first-year graduate student. So what exactly is the basal ganglia? The basal ganglia is a mass of gray matter located in the deeper portion of the cerebrum. It is part of the extrapyramidal system. So throughout this class, we've talked a lot about the extrapyramidal system, but I wanted to review it one more time. The extrapyramidal system is a network of neurons that control involuntary movement. Duffy, in 2005, mentions that the basal ganglia is involved in the indirect activation pathway of the extrapyramidal system. The workings of the indirect activation pathway, according to Duffy, are not well known, but he states that it compromises neural pathways with connections between the cortex and the lower motor neurons. Now I want to talk about the main components of the basal ganglia. So, according to our textbook, some scientists disagree about the structures of the basal ganglia, but for the purposes of this presentation, I want to discuss 5 components of the basal ganglia. Those 5 components are the caudate nucleus, the putamen, the globus pallidus, the substantia nigra, and the subthalamic nucleus. When talking about the basal ganglia, a lot of the times you'll hear the corpus striatum reference. So the corpus striatum is made up of 3 portions, and those 3 portions are the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. So the caudate nucleus and the putamen are responsible for input to the basal ganglia, and the globus pallidus, along with the substantia nigra, which I mentioned earlier, is responsible for the output of the basal ganglia. So here we have a frontal section of the corpus striatum. So a lot of the times you will hear the putamen and the globus pallidus referred to as the lentiform nucleus or nuclei, and then there's also the caudate nucleus, but all 3 of these portions make up the corpus striatum. I also wanted us to look at the corpus striatum from a lateral view. So right here you can see that that is the head of the caudate nucleus, and then right here you have the lentiform nucleus, which once again is the putamen and the globus pallidus put together, and then right down here is the tail of the caudate nucleus. So this is just to give you a lateral view of the corpus striatum. So next we will be talking about the substantia nigra, and the substantia nigra is a little different from the corpus striatum based on its anatomical function versus its physiological function. So the substantia nigra is considered a part of the basal ganglia in its function, but not its anatomical location. Technically, the substantia nigra is located in the midbrain, but physiologically it works within the basal ganglia. There are 2 components of the substantia nigra, the pars compacta and the pars reticulata. So the degeneration of the pars compacta has been linked to the causation of Parkinson's disease, given that the pars compacta has been found to be responsible for dopamine regulation. So we'll be talking about this a little later, but the substantia nigra is one of the biggest components of the basal ganglia that has been linked in research to the causation of Parkinson's disease. The subthalamic nucleus is similar to the substantia nigra in that its anatomical location versus its physiological function are different. So the subthalamic nucleus is located in the diencephalon, not in the basal ganglia, but its function is to receive projections from the basal ganglia. And damage to this structure and its circuits has been linked to Huntington's disease as well as hyperkinetic dysarthria of the chorea type. I included this picture so where you could see the substantia nigra and the subthalamic nucleus since that was not included in the picture earlier. So right here you will see this is the substantia nigra, and then right above it you have the subthalamic nucleus, and then Just to give you a frame of reference, here is the corpus striatum, which we talked about earlier. So that includes the putamen, the caudate nucleus body, and the globus pallidus. So when talking about the basal ganglia, you also have to talk about the basal ganglia control circuits. So these circuits originate in the cerebrum and bypass through the basal ganglia, then return to the cortex. So there are 4 control circuits that are identified with the basal ganglia, and those 4 control circuits are the motor loop, the cognitive loop, the limbic loop, and the oculomotor loop. And it's important to remember that all of these loops are associated with the extrapyramidal system. Now that we've reviewed the basal ganglia in depth, I want us to begin to look at Parkinson's disease. So for this information, I went straight to the National Institutes of Health website to see how they define Parkinson's and the basal ganglia's role in causing Parkinson's disease. So according to NIH, there are 4 primary symptoms of Parkinson's disease. The first symptom is a tremor of the hands, arms, legs, jaw, and/or face, rigidity or stiffness of the limbs and trunk, bradykinesia, which is a slowness of movement, and then postural instability. Age of onset is typically around 60 years or older, and the disease is typically idiopathic in nature. Other symptoms of Parkinson's disease could include depression, difficulty with swallowing, chewing, and speaking. Patients could have skin problems and sleep disruptions. In this slide, we will be talking specifically about the basal ganglia's effect on Parkinson's disease. So earlier, when we were talking about the substantia nigra, we mentioned how it is responsible for the production of dopamine. So, Parkinson's disease is caused by a reduction of dopamine in the striatum. So this reduction of dopamine leads to a neurochemical imbalance. This imbalance of dopamine, which is produced in the substantia nigra, causes a deficit in the corpus striatum, which, as mentioned earlier, includes the globus pallidus, the putamen, and the caudate nucleus. This neurochemical imbalance is further explained by the basal ganglia when it produces excess excitatory neurotransmitters, which is the acetylcholine, that act on the neurons in comparison to the amount of inhibitory neurotransmitters, which is the dopamine. This reduction of dopamine leads to several different deficits, specifically in motor movements as well as speech and swallowing deficits. So the first of the motor effects is hypokinesia, which is a reduced range of motion. And then we have bradykinesia, which is a slow and reduced range of motion. Then we have akinesia, which is a term that means a delayed initiation of movement. We also have rigidity and postural instability as well. For speech deficits, there are 2 main areas that characterize this disorder. So the first of which is hypokinetic dysarthria. And hypokinetic dysarthria, some errors include prosodic errors, such as monopitch, reduced stress, and monoloudness. Imprecise consonants and harsh or breathy voice quality can be noted in these patients. Dysphagia is also noted in many cases of Parkinson's disease. For my final slide, I did want to include some possible treatments. So one of the first is pharmacological, and this can be done through the replacement of dopamine in the striatum. They use L-DOPA, which is a chemical that can reach the striatum, and L-DOPA is converted by the brain into dopamine. Also, there are drugs that can be used to decrease the effects of acetylcholine. Another common treatment used by speech pathologist is the Lee Silverman voice training, which targets vocal effort scaling through increased vocal loudness via intensive, high-effort vocalization and speech exercises. And here are my references. I hope that you have enjoyed this presentation and that you have a great day. Thank you.